Hey, yeah, yo.
Yo, what's going on, people? Welcome to another episode of Soul Sessions. We're in the building. We're here today, my brother Craig. We're going to be discussing a couple topics regarding the community. I want to touch on some of those issues we spoke about earlier in the year on the live. There was a lot of intriguing comments that came back off the back of that conversation. I feel like there's been a bit of a time period that's gone since then. And for me personally, just looking community wise what's going on and just trying to see if there's changes and if we're mobilizing, if we're doing things. I haven't seen it as much, you know what I'm saying? Not to say, obviously, my head's been on the ground. We've been doing this, the resale stuff and out there doing the runs with the homeless and things like that. But yet, touching on since COVID and stuff like that, and the Black Lives Matter movement that was going on, and everyone was marching, people were coming out. We saw a lot of people looking like they wanted to bring around a change. We saw brands, we saw businesses, we saw everybody moving different. But since the back of that, for me, I'm feeling like things have quietened down. I don't know where it's really going. I just wanted to get your foresight on that. You know what I'm saying? What are you saying?
Well, I think first and foremost, it's about understanding the context of what was happening. I think you've also got to bear in mind that we had a lockdown, and it was kind of the situation where everybody was in their houses, quarantine, and it was kind of the first time in which people had the opportunity to kind of see what was happening to black men in the hands of the criminal justice system. Now, from a historical context, we can say that these things have been happening. We can go back as far as lynching and saying that there was always mobs of people that would have captured that type of behaviour from one group or another that were treating black men in a particular way. I think what George Floyd did is it was one of those types of incidents, and I don't see it any different to Eric Garner and some of the other cases that happened in America, but you've got to also bear in mind the time frame and the response from the George Floyd situation. For one time, it was the first time we actually heard that there was no motivation, there was no argument that anybody can come with to say this was a justification for that type of behavior. Now, from a black perspective, there's never justification for that type of behavior, but you'd always find that in these types of scenarios where black men were getting killed by police or at the hands of the police, there was always some sort of justification. Well, if he didn't shut off his mouth, then that wouldn't have happened.
Before victim, isn't it?
If he just put his hands up, that wouldn't have happened. But for this time and for 8 minutes and 49 seconds or 47 seconds, this man was put in a position and pleading non-stop, saying that he can't breathe, saying that he just needed to drink some water. The man even called out for his mum, and this individual and his colleagues had no humanity. And I think that is the crux of what the situation was. And I think that what the uproar did is it made white society stand up and say, you know what, we agree with what you're saying and we hear what you're saying. And I think that explains why there was such a kind of global phenomena where you're seeing black and white people and people of all nations coming together to say, you know what, we stand with this idea of Black Lives Matter. And the deeper conversation from a black perspective is, and this is kind of the important thing where you need to check history, and history is always important. It's not necessarily the organization, but the movement stands on the shoulders of freedom fighters and social activists of the past. We can go from the Panther Party, we can look at the Deacons of Defense, we can look at the Nation of Islam, we can look at Marcus Mosiah Garvey, we can look at Malcolm X, we can look at Martin Luther King, we can look at stages of individuals that were ultimately fighting for freedom, justice and equality, and regardless if you agree with their philosophy or not, what Black Lives Matter does is stand on their shoulders. So with this in mind, the question is what do we do now? So there's an outrage, there's an outrage, the people are upset, people are angry about the way in which people are treated within criminal justice systems, and the statistics don't lie. You know, we can look at the way in which black men are stopped more than their white counterparts. We can look at the criminal justice itself and look at sentencing guidelines as it looks at an individual that is white compared to their black counterparts. We can see in terms of the lengthy sentences that are handed out. So we know that there's a systemic issue that exists within our society that impacts individual of colour. And the protests were kind of global in the sense that people are connecting those experiences and those histories. So when you look at America and what was going on here, I think the conversation that was happening here in the UK is that, wait there, we have racism just as bad as what's going on in America. They may not be shooting us, but individuals are being killed at the hands of the police. Here we can look at, Mark Doggins, we can look at the Smiley Cultures, we can look at the Mikey Powells, the Kingsley Burrells, and there's a number of cases that we can look at where individuals have been put in situations where they've been restrained by the police and died at the hands of the police. Yeah. And I think now we're kind of connecting those conversations. A new conversation that's now happening in a UK context is that Britain is institutionally racist and always has been. And what people are now doing is checking the history. And that helps us to explain with the stuff that's been going on in Bristol, when people are pulling down statues. And I think part of the problem is two things. Number one, within the British society, we don't understand our history and understanding what British Empire was. And for those of us that are coming from the Caribbean, those of us that are coming from the continent of Africa, what the British Empire did and created that kind of legacy of wealth in order for white privilege to exist within our present society. And I believe that white people in this country don't understand that. So it looks like when the Black Lives Matter campaigns were ultimately out there, is that it's an attack towards white people. And that might explain what was going on in London, where you've got like the EDLs and Tommy Robinsons and all of that going on. So whilst all of that confusion is ultimately going on, you got those of us that understand what's going on from a historical context. And I think the second part to my argument is, what's the strategy? So where your original point where you're saying that it feels like things have died down, I agree with you to some extent, because yes, in terms of the protest and that may have died down, but I do believe that it's an opportunity now that many key stakeholders that once didn't have a voice are now starting to opening doors to have those voices to systemic change. So my premise has always been this, that I've never been a person that's down to protest, because I believe that when we're talking about fighting for freedom, justice and equality, everything takes stages. So the people that are out there, with the civil unrest and making a whole heap of noise with the banners and whatever, that's just the third stage of making the world to recognize what it is that we're talking about. Then the second stage is then you have the warriors that are going to challenge the powers that be. This is where individuals like myself coming out able to articulate a particular argument to make a claim of what it is that we want. Now, my challenge to our communities is that whilst we have been talking about the things that we want, we need a better, what I would say, plan of how we're going to approach these systems and how we do it. Because what's happening is there's brilliant work taking place in silos. So, for example, with the work that I do, I'm working now with local councils, and that door's never been open before. Where these now local councils now up and down the country are saying, you know what, we want that systemic change. What does it look like? And can you help us in terms of kind of steering that or creating that legacy within our organization, so individuals of color can come into this organization and not necessarily feel that they're being mistreated for a particular way. So that's brilliant, but it takes place in silos. And I think what needs to take place, and again, this goes back to my previous point about history, you look at the plans that were set out by people like, Marcus Messiah Garvey. They had a strategy and a plan, and it wasn't a plan that one man was doing. It was a collective of people that had ideals. And I believe that that's probably the problem. I think people are realizing and recognizing, okay, cool, we've got the ears now, but what do we do as a collective? And I think also part of the problem in our country is that you also got our white counterparts that don't know what to do. So they now know that the door's open. So this is where we talk about, well, anti-racist practice needs to be the next stage. So it's not about what I call black sympathy. So what we don't want from our white counterparts is that they get so emotional about the things that's going on, because from a person of color, that's triggering. I don't need you to cry in front of me in order for you to show me that you understand my reality. What I need is action. So with those that are watching these particular podcasts and individuals that are invested in supporting the cause against police brutality and systemic racism and state violence, it's about what power do you hold within the position that you have within society, understanding your privilege and being comfortable to be uncomfortable talking about those issues of privilege within society, and what are you going to do about it. And I believe that when that mindset gets to the hearts and minds of everybody in the UK, that's when I think that there's going to be some systemic change. But you've also got to bear in mind that we're fighting a system, and that system was created by default to impact and adversely impact the lives of individuals that look like you and I. And those that are challenging the system ultimately are going to fight and come and get some sort of backlash, because the system is not broken. You know, the system has been created to sustain and to privilege and keep individuals in a superior position while everyone else is inferior. So we have to understand some of the kind of dynamics that's kind of happening. So yes, there is positive that's coming out of it. Yes, doors are opening. Yes, there's brilliant work taking place in silos. But when we're talking about a strategy, I think that is something that I think that we as collectives need to start probably coming together a little bit more about, talking about what ultimately that looks like.
Yeah, 100%. To like, there's so many points that you've just mentioned in that piece, but an overall, picture that I'm getting that is massive in terms of just being even able to kind of understand and then to fathom and to be able to approach the situation in a way that we can really impact in terms of just policy and change and stuff in the community is education. But I feel like as a community or a group of people, what does education look like and what does it mean? Because a lot of the time we talk about schooling and putting people in schools and stuff like that, and but for years our community has been getting educated and has been going through school, and we got the doctors and we got lawyers and we got people in high positions and judges and all of those type of things, but yet we're still in the same place. So when we talk about education and we talk about schooling and we talk about, empowering our community upon knowledge, what does that look like, and what is that?
Can I jump in with
Go
you
on.
there? It's like, I think for a lot of people to understand that education and knowledge are not the same thing. So when people say definition of education is you go to school, you go to university, you learn a very particular brand of what you're getting. So up until now, people just find that Churchill's racist. If you've done your research, like for me, as a white man, it's different. My family are Irish. So there's certain things I learned growing up about the empire. All of this stuff, I was predisposed to it already because of my grandma and whatever. When she came same time as the Caribbean, no blacks, no dogs, no Irish. I was brought up on that. So it makes it easier to understand certain things and see certain things. But when you go into school, and for how long my kids are learning the same history I learned, I'm 37. Do you see what I'm saying? The curriculum's not changed at all. So you're constantly teaching kids that Churchill's a hero, and not whether it's the famines or what you said about black people and the same, so on and so forth. It's hard when people step out of that to kind of rejig their minds at 18, 19, 20. It's a lot more difficult, whereas young people are sponges. I think you're going to lose, say what you said about your background before, Sunday schools and how important that was in upbringings and things like that. Do you think like bringing that back into communities
Most
now?
definitely. And I think, again, going back to my previous point about history, those strategic plans and blueprints have been laid out for us. We're talking about when I grew up in the Pan-Africanist Saturday school movement, and that was kind of the go-to within our community that almost kind of was set up to give us a secondary education. And that secondary education was about knowledge of self, understanding economics, understanding, politics, understanding different aspects of law, and those things have been pulled out. So we have to recognize, and going back to my point again, that the system is designed not to be broken. So when we have children that go into the education system and are learning about the same history, it's for a purpose. 100%. They're not going to change the curriculum because the curriculum ultimately sustains that same idea that these individuals are superior and everybody isn't. And there's a reason why they only have Black History Month in October. There is a reason why they only teach us about Rosa Parks. There's a reason why they teach us only about Martin Luther King. And they don't really talk about anybody else. Yeah, they don't talk about the fact that, slavery was kind of the destruction and European slavery and the transatlantic slave trade, as well as the Arab slave trade, ultimately kind of interrupted what we call Black history. And I think because we don't understand these concepts and we don't understand these histories, we're given this one particular type of education, which is the Vikings and all of these. They don't talk about the Moors that came into Europe because there's no room for them to do it in their curriculum. So what's important is when we talk about, going back to your original point about strategy, it's about understanding what other communities are doing and recognizing that the education system is not teaching their children to be key stakeholders and leaders for the future. So we create our own scenario, our own situation, our own institutions, and we bring our children in. And those individuals that can't get their children to those types of institutions, then we support them outside of the education system. And these are the things that we need to start bringing back. And these are things that are not new and haven't been things that haven't happened before. But we just need to have that kind of mindset. So with the mindset, like individuals that have got their education and disappeared, it's about many of them now coming back. And I've always just had that mindset that if I've ever gone into the education system and got my degree, my skills and knowledge and expertise, I'm always going to bring that back to the community. But I'm doing one aspect of the puzzle. We need those that are in entrepreneurship. We're going to need individuals that are in business. We need individuals that are in, other forms of economics, individuals that are involved in politics, individuals to come together to say, you know what, this is what the plan needs to look like in contemporary times. Because it can't just be education that looks at one thing. That's just one. It's got to be multifaceted, and we have to respond in that particular type of way because we know the youths that we're dealing with, most of them want money.
100%.
And there's loads of millionaires that are in our community that own McDonald's and own these things, but the youths don't know that they exist in our community. I know that they exist. So it's about getting them to understand. And the reason why I say that is because I'll give you a quick story. I had a conversation with a millionaire from our local community. This is back in Birmingham. And my phone was blowing off and the conversation was, you know what, Craig, we need to get people together in a room and talk about what we need to be doing in terms of the Black Lives Matter situation. And I kind of challenged them and said, you know what, I feel a little bit let down because it's taken for this scenario for an individual like yourself to contact me and say, you want me to then host a meeting with other rich individuals within our local community. There's loads of individuals in my shoes that are opening up little charities, organizations, working with young people, working with mental health, working with young people with disabilities, working with the homeless, so on and so forth. And none of you don't support. And when I say support, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're giving us money, but show us how to link to the right accountant, show us how to set up our structure and to make sure that our board situation sorted. Now, what happens is individuals like yourself, and it's not just them, it's also religious leaders in our community. It's generally the well-off people in our community. You only call my phone when things go wrong. And that's the problem. So we also need to have an internal conversation about the mindset that also exists amongst what we know as the Black bourgeoisie. And there's books that talk about this idea about this kind of growing Black middle class that forget about the individuals that are on the ground. And that's why when we talk about the young people that are out there and I use the word civil unrest, I try not to use the word protest, that I don't challenge them because I understand the pain and the suffering that they're ultimately going through. You can't mistreat a people and keep mistreating a people and oppressing a people and not expect them to not respond. Now, I may not agree with their methodology and how they do it, but I understand the pain and what ultimately people are ultimately going through. And when I talk about those individuals, they're the same individuals that when I speak to these individuals of influence, it's those people that need to connect to those people on the ground. And that's what the strategy ultimately should look like. So it's not just education. It's also about economics. It's also about mobilizing in terms of politically, how do you get buildings? Everybody's talking about having money, and you think about, we're guilty sometimes that, we buy all the Nike, and that in terms of the black pound, what comes out of our pockets every single month, every single week, and all of the things that we like, the drip that everybody has, if we was to utilize that finance to buy buildings on one strip and say, all right, then this is a grocery store, that we're making sure that the groceries and the vegetables that are in that building are from farms that we've harvest the vegetables, the fruit, and so on so forth. We've got another building that's for schooling, another building that's to help young people that are coming up, are entrepreneurs and whatnot. That's something that again, that has happened in history, and we're in a better place to kind of get those things going, because man are in business, man are not broke, man have got money. So it's about coming together and having a different type of mindset in the current time frame and what we face with. So when we look at the kind of issues that are happening with our young people now, they're reflecting off a society that is impacted them in a range of different ways. And we kind of talk about the youth and forget about the fact that we're breeding them in a society and in an environment that we as the adults that ultimately have created.
100%. That followed on onto something else that I wanted to go on to. That was with, obviously, one of the things that we come across is obviously with education is the finance, which you kind of covered in terms of, as a community, what's more important to us. Is it the education, or is it the finance aspect of, like, example, there's a lot of people that might not be educated, that you mentioned, but they have the finances and through that they have the know-how to kind of point us and take us into a different direction. But at the same time, because they might not have that education, and I call that same type of education of knowing oneself, I feel like it's just becoming a detriment to the community in terms of like, just because a man's an adult, it doesn't mean he knows any better. You know what I mean? And sometimes we look to people who are, older than us or have been there before, and we think like, you should know better, or you should do. But when you check how they were raised and how they were brought up, you come to realize this man he ain't got a clue. Sometimes they're less wiser than the young. But I feel like moving on to our young people, well, you're good, yeah. Moving on to our young people and their mental health and their state of, like, the environment, like you said, that we're breeding them into and we're bringing them into. How are our young people gonna survive where they are now to get to where we need to get to? Are we breeding the right generation of young people to kind of take us to that next step, or is the media overselling the point that young black people are in a certain situation, and the reality is not that? Because sometimes if you're just an average person who don't have a lot of knowledge about the community, and you look at the TV, you're going to say the young black people, they can't take us nowhere. These kids are mash up. But is that our reality, or is that really a small number? Because
the first mistake is looking at mainstream media for it. I've always said that I'll refuse to have a debate or whatever it is with someone and their only main source is watching the news. Because you can't get a balanced picture, because it's being sold from whatever political point of view it is being sold. It's to make you watch the program. So the more sensational, the more derogative the headlines, the more people can, did you see? It doesn't even have to necessarily be true. We've seen that with X amount of stories, 48 hours later, it wasn't a terrorist attack, it wasn't this, it wasn't that. But the damage is done.
Yeah,
and that's not by accident. Like, let's not pretend.
Yeah, but I think that I feel like the power of the media is at the point where it's believed, and I think there's only a few individuals who don't take it to be, in a lack of better words, the gospel, or what. Do you know what I mean? Because it's come to the point where I feel like, because of the media and because how maybe the black community is perceived, even us as a black community believe that perception to an extent that if you're on the streets and you see a white brother or something like that, and you have a little issue, you're just gonna push it aside. He's an idiot. But if you see a black brother and your perception of what you've seen, you're just gonna think like you have to take you're on alert, you're on the next level, and you believe that description that's been given. So I feel like,
and I think that you're right to, and again it goes back to a previous and earlier point that I made, that we're dealing with a system. And I think when we talk about the system of racism, it's understanding what racism is. It operates like a system. Nothing doesn't operate in a silo. It doesn't operate separately. The media is a part of that entity.
It's all in tandem.
So when we're talking about, the system operates in all forms of human activity. And I think when you understand that, then you kind of understand the kind of build up to that reality of, like you've just said, a man walking up the road. Like, the moment I say a black child is born in this society, they're already being racialized. And the connotations of what it means to be black in Western society has connotations and add-ons to what that ultimately means. And that exists not just in education, entertainment, going back to the media, also
Healthcare.
economics. We're talking about law. We're talking about the implementation of law by the policing. And also just the kind of interactions that the human beings are ultimately having. So when you go back to a historical context and history, this is why I keep kind of stressing the notion of history, because history is the best teacher to what we're dealing with today. You've got to bear in mind, if you look at anywhere in Western society where you've had an issue with a people, you got to bear in mind, let's go back to Jim Crow, for example, when we're talking about segregation in America, and then I'm going to bring it back to the UK. You know, they needed to create laws and pass legislation in order to sanction certain behaviors between white people and black people. So if a black man was looking at a white woman, that was enough for him to get mobbed and lynched. Then we fast forward that to now where we're talking about, all right, we're talking about complete segregation from schools, from socializing. The whole kind of system was framed on segregation. Then laws changed. And then everybody now becomes cognitive dissonant, like racism didn't exist.
Yeah.
And now we're trying to function as if everything is kind of okay and everything is normal. So then we look at those behaviors that existed in places like America and we look, okay, well, what's happened here in the UK? And we kind of forget about, again, what I said earlier about the British Empire and the role that had in terms of creating Britain to be Great Britain. And we go back to the Windrush era. We talk about some of the kind of conversations that you've just mentioned as well, where you had people that were coming from different parts of the world to build Great Britain, but how were they treated when they were in the country? So when I talk about my grandparents didn't come to this country and have any criminal record. They all came with skills, expertise. They came with a trade. You couldn't come to the country. Yeah. So how is it that their great grandchildren or grandchildren are now being labelled the most violent, the biggest thugs, biggest terrorists, biggest drug dealers? So we know that there's a system at play when we're talking about how has this construction been created to make us even believe, even ourselves, that we are the problem. Because we're talking about, we make up, 3 to 4% of the population. Yeah. But then we talk about, the criminal justice system is 23%. And then we talk about, black people are 9 to 10 times more likely to be stopped by the police, and even more so 10 to 11 times in COVID-19. So we know that there's a hostile mentality towards individuals of difference within this country. So if that is the belief or mindset, the boogeyman are these people of color, then we're going to create a whole system to make sure that our children and the next generation believe and will be prepared to treat these individuals how we're making them out to be. So when we then talk about the media, what the media does is just reinforce all of the things that people are already thinking. So if I can talk about crime and I can talk about knife crime, for example, what I won't talk about is the Home Office definition about any individual that carries a sharp object would be classified as knife crime, which then talks about all forms of violence. What I'm not going to talk about is that, but what I am going to talk about is one aspect of knife crime, which means individuals that carry weapons that happen to live in urban environments, then their proximity may be predominant individuals that look like each other. We're only going to talk about that aspect of violence, but what we're not going to talk about is hooliganism. What we're not going to talk about is white males that kill their partners in domestic violence cases, which is classified as knife crime. So we're not going to talk about those cases, because if we do that, statistically, those numbers are going to be far greater than talking about youths that are on road that happen to carry knives. So when we know that that's the mindset, it's the same methodology that is used around the issue around Islam and terrorism. So what we're not going to do is talk about extremism and terrorism in all forms. We're only going to talk about extremism as it relates to one group of people that have a particular mindset, that are utilizing Quranic text in order to behave in a particular type of way. And that's the only thing we're going to talk about. But we know statistically, far-right extremists commit more acts of terrorism than any other group. We talk about people that, that do things to animals. And we talk about extremism in all forms. So we know that there is a game that is being played. And the ignorant are the ones that are going to sap that up and going to suck all of that up. And like you just said, anybody that watches the news and takes that as gospel are going to be the ones that have the problem.
And
So
sadly-
like with the issue around racism now, just as my final point, with the stuff in Bristol and the stuff in London, that's why white communities were behaving the way that they are, because they will take media as gospel and say, well, listen, what's wrong with Churchill? What's wrong with all of these big statues? In my opinion, and what I've learned is that these individuals are the ones that made the city to what it is, but not realizing and recognizing that behind them making that city and making Great Britain great is on the backs of free labor of individuals that look like me. So history is important.
Yeah, it's deep, man, because I feel like when we go through so many of these aspects as well, it's like sometimes you're fighting two battles, because you're fighting sometimes the battle of just, dealing with the uneducated within the community to try to convince them. It's like you have to convince them that what really took place and what happened, a part of history, is real. Because it's come to a point where it's like you're dealing or you're talking with individuals from the community as if it didn't really happen, or let's just get over it, let's move forward. But you're moving forward to where are you going? So when we're trying to get onto this pathway of creating a better community for us, just in general, it's becoming more difficult, because again, you're dealing with individuals who you're fighting a battle within your own community to educate people. Because you can see, like I said, the reason I mentioned the fact that even black people looking at themselves based on how they're portrayed in the media is having an effect on families, on upbringings and the family structure that we have in the community. So moving on, there's so much that we can cover, but moving on to like the family aspect, how is that affected? Like, how important is the family aspect in terms of us building and moving into a certain direction? Because there's so many things that we can cover, but I just want our audience to get like a rounded view in terms of where we're at and where we're going.
And I think, sorry, did you have a point?
Yeah, I was just what you're saying about how you manipulate it. It's the same with field and house. That's what they use as times in slavery as America, right? Field and house. That was designed but nothing but to separate people, right? Of a particular colour. That's carried into everything now, because you see certain people, they get a higher... Why is he talking like a white man?
Yeah.
See that separation? I think like what you said, getting back to sitting around round table, there's still that separation. He's got a good... You don't think he's black no more. That attitude that we've heard, do you get what I'm saying? And I think, like, to enforce your point, there's always been that in the background when you look at history as well, as a way to keep people divide and conquer. That was British empires. That's their thing. You go to a country, divide, caste system in Asia, wherever it is, you always need that to make a people and to make the system, because it's racism, capitalism, all of that on top of each other, all these layers. You need a significant other for the masses to look at and think, that's the threat, not the people who are screwing you for taxes, not the people who, like those white people who say they're disenfranchised, they lap it up. Because Margaret Thatcher and white politicians who closed down the mines, the steel industry, all of those things are white politicians, but it's easier for them to look at a significant other and say, that's the threat, rather than looking at someone who looks just like you, because that's not in the DNA where you've had white people separated as house and field or whatever it is. Do you get what I mean? Where I'm coming from?
Yeah.
I think it's just like people need to look and see where's the separation starting before you can look at and how to come together.
And before you get onto this point here, is that what's scary for me is that I come across, from the black community, or we say, from the colored community, whether it's Asian, blacks, wherever you want to be, where people are so surprised how deep the effect of the system is. Yeah. So if a man feels something racial, which is like, when something happens racially and it's like, it could be something as small as how your child was dealt with at the hospital. A man will say to you, a man will say to you, you're being too much now. You're saying they're racist at the hospital now. You're like, man just can't fathom how deep it is. So when the community is like that, or you watch something on TV and you think, that was blatantly racist, and the man says, here we go again. Yeah. It's like they can't see it.
And that is the kind of, and I'm glad you've said that, because that's the crux of what we're dealing with. And the way that the system operates as such. It's covert and overt, and it's conscious and it's subconscious. So when you talk about those incidents, you're talking about microaggressions and how that operates. So you can be in the workplace and we're sitting there right now and a man just looking at you and doing that thing. You're thinking, yo, how come my man's looking at me like that? And nobody else can't see. But you know what that means. It's just like words have symbolic power. A man that calls you boy, you know, what you calling me boy for? Because they know what words mean and the impact that words have on individuals of colour. So when we're talking about now the concept of family, I think the first thing to kind of understand is that with the point that you've both just made, we're dealing with intergenerational trauma. And until we understand the fact that we're dealing with intergenerational trauma, then you can understand why you see some of the behaviours. So when you look at kind of like Dr. Leary's work, when she talks about post-traumatic slave syndrome, it's a real thing. Because we can look at any other community that's had any kind of destruction of any kind. You know, we can look at the Jewish community, for example, and we talk about the Holocaust and it's been recognized. When we talk about post-traumatic stress and post-traumatic stress disorders and things that have kind of linked because of a historical situation that's impacted on generations. But then you're talking about a community, a group of people that have gone through 200 years through the Arab slave trade, 400 years through European slavery and servitude, and then we're free. And then we're not expecting like certain behaviors to exist within our community. So all of those things that you talk about when we talk about the idea about even our own people, we understand as Dr. Francis Cress Wilson said, we're all victims of racism, white supremacy. And when you understand that you're a victim, victims are going to behave in a range of different types of ways. So we look at current behaviors that may exist in the family and check it. And I'm sure that you'll probably acknowledge this. So I think even within our families, you may go to a school and you know that there's a child or another child that you know of and you know the mum and dad and you may be just reasoning with them in the morning and say, you know what, child's smart, man. Nah, but he's bad at home. He's got peer mouth. So the person has said that your child is intelligent, give them a appraisal for the thing that they've done, and the response from the mum or the dad is, yeah, but they're bad and they misbehave. The reason why we do that, and it's been actually tested, the reason why we do that is from a historical context, that when the slave master used to approach us on the plantation and want to take our children, we would always dumb them down and make it out that they're disobedient so that the slave master would never take them and move them to another plantation and would never see them ever again. And that mindset and behavior exists. And it's mad because even my grandparent and my nan love her to bits. But if someone said, yo, Craig's into, but him have no sense sometimes. So always it's like automatic. So you've got to understand that if these behaviors exist in our own community, we're talking about bringing up our own children in an environment where they're getting appraisal for the good things that they do. So it's almost like a kind of a confusion sometimes for some children. And then we also got to deal with the fact that we're talking about the system that we're dealing with has always been in communities of colour, it's always been to remove the man outside of the family and disrupt the family structure anyway. So it's always been that, you talk about the kind of systems of free money and you can have freebies from the system as such. And what did that create? That that women, single mothers now that can say, listen, I don't have a partner, I can live in a household a particular type of way, and that means that the government are gonna look after me in a particular type of way, or not to do that. And this is not knocking any single mothers, I'll make that very clear before them start coming at the end of the session. But what I'm saying is that the system is created in such that we're put in a position where we create a scenario where we tell lies in order for us to be able to live and to survive. And in that kind of makeup within families, and a father not being inside of the household to be there when his children wake up, that causes a problem, because now we're talking about fatherless children that have fathers but don't have the presence. And then we look at the community and how it's been designed and created. And you also then got to talk about the incarceration numbers. Then you've got to talk about the criminalization of black men within our society. So you kind of realize that there's almost like an attack on black males within the society. And then when we talk about black women now, when we talk about women being in positions of influence, how are they treated within education? How are they treated within, law? And I work with a lot of, professors, I work with a lot of doctors, I work with, a lot of managers that work in very credible organizations, and they tell me how they're treated within their organizations. So we're talking about families in the concept of we are become so isolated as a community that sometimes it feels like we're turning on each other. And going back to my point about victims of the system, that's what ultimately happens. So you listen to the conversations that our present society are having now, and you'll probably even find someone that's probably come from Africa or someone that's come from the Caribbean that will say, we don't want the Polish in this country, go back to where you come from.
Yeah.
So the mindset is that we've now forgot our own history, and we've forgot that all of us are victims of that same system, that we're just getting parachuted into communities, lack of finances, lack of money, lack of resources, lack of economics, poor education, poor housing conditions, and now we're turning on each other. So now I've got issue with the Polishman across the road because I believe now that he's set up and he's got a new situation, and my boiler's still mash up. And I can't understand why he's been given a new house. So my frustration now is not the system. The frustration is the brother that's across the road. And whilst those distractions exist within family, what it does is turn us away from dealing with the system. And that's the reason why when these things happen, if you notice that there's always certain patterns of behavior. So when we seem like we're close to getting to a goal, they'll just throw a carnival or throw a rave or throw a party or throw a mad sale. Because they know that we're trying to buy them nice kicks, B. They know we're trying to do that. They know, because they know that we're so broken. And we have to, again, understand what slavery did. It ultimately destroyed the people. It destroyed us to the point of we almost became robotic. And we became individuals that were kind of remote control or operating on remote control as how white people wanted us to ultimately be. So when you mention things like knowledge of self, that is something that we need to regain back in our communities. And it happens and it does exist. That we need to return back to a place where we can be like, you know what? This is what we are and this is who we are. And whilst we're having these conversations, I don't want us to kind of ignore the fact that there are many of us in our community that are entrepreneurs, that are businessmen, are businesswomen, that are in education and doing these things. And we're having conversations about mobilizing. That's a conversation I have with my boys. We're talking about like things like property, having things that we own, having a piece of the earth, that we actually can do something with. So you know what? Like one of the conversations I'm having with a group of people at the minute is, all right, cool. Let's have a system, or let's think of a system that, every week we put down a little bit of money and let's just have a 5-year plan. And then with that 5 years, I'm not saying that I'm a part of the building, but let's have a building. And if somebody then has an idea of what they want to do with that building, that's one. Then let's go to the next one, because guess what? Every other community is doing it.
Yeah.
So we have to have that same kind of mindset. So whilst I talk about the trauma that exists within family and the disfranchisement of families that exist, we also have to talk about those that are doing really well. So just like how the media will portray that all it is about violence, for every youth that I know that bosses a gun or stab someone, I can talk about 10 other youths that have just left school with GCSEs and gone college. But it's not the role of us to be relying on the media to tell us the stories about ourselves. This is where podcasts like this and we then inventing ways within media that we can tell our own stories. Because again, if we're leaving a system to tell our story, it's only going to be pictured in one particular type of way. And I actually work with more youths that are doing positive as opposed to youths that are negative. It just so happens that the negative gets highlighted, and the people that call individuals like myself in to do work is only to deal with generally the negative. But I know more youths in college, I know more youths that are trying to set up businesses than I know men that are on the road.